Well, it's not perfect, but we're gonna paint it anyway. Sometimes you just have to decide when it's done enough, and it's done enough. So I've got the chines sanded. That's the last thing I did. And how I sand the chines I covered in the Core Sound 15 build videos, but basically you want to use a block like this. This is 11 inches long, and you want to go on a diagonal approximately 45 degrees, rolling it over the chine. That keeps the chine fair and rounds the chine. And then I go back the other way, and you just work your way down the length. That's all I did. And I sanded out the trunk one more time, and I sanded the corners of my transom. So this corner's rounded, that corner's rounded, this corner is pretty sharp. I just barely took the edge off of it, but it's nice and sharp. And in here, these edges here are rounded. I'll probably prime down into here, and then when we flip the boat over, we'll have to finish out the inside of the well. And I'm also going to tape off. I'm going to tape off just below the shear line so I don't get primer where I'm going to glue my rub rail. This I blended in so you can't really feel anything here, so it's nice and smooth transition into the stem. And my keel strip has been sanded down, so it's just a big smooth lump down the keel. To flip it right side up again so we can finish working on the top side for getting the boat ready for the mess about. So I'll just show you my setup. I've improved it a little bit. I've still got this eye strap here at the same spot as before, and I'm probably just going to leave those holes so that I can always reinstall that eye strap. I can't have it there with the rudders in place, but I can always just take the rudder off, put the eye strap, the eyelet on, and then if I need to flip the boat, it's ready to go. And I've set up a 6-to-1 on this end, and you'll notice that I'm pulling sort of on an angle back. That helps the rope to clear the back of the boat when the boat rotates. If it was dead vertical, then it would rub and it would try to catch on these edges and corners. And then on this end, I made another hole in the ceiling and drilled a hole at the very top of my rafter, which is a 2x6. So that's got plenty of strength there, and I'm sure I'll patch that hole in eventually. And I forgot that I had this nice 7-to-1 main sheet set up for the trimaran. So I took that out of its box, and that's nice because it has a cleat here so I can easily raise and lower. And then I've got a pennant line going to the bow eye, which I've installed. There's no backing block for this yet. That's one of my to-do list items. So it's just through bolted with the glass tape on the inside. And importantly, this pennant line is long enough so that when the boat flips right side up, the pennant line will be down here so that the block won't be against the side of the hull. You wouldn't want the block to be like right here at the eye strap because it would be hitting the hull. And also, that's angled ever so slightly out. So anyway, for what it's worth, that's my setup, and hopefully somebody else can set something up similar to this. But if not, you just have a bunch of friends over, carry the boat outside, flip it over in the grass, and then carry it back inside. I've got the boat set back down on some supports, and what I've done is I already took my cradle apart, but I'm using the long rails of the cradle assembly, and I've reinstalled the two end cross beams for the front and the back, and I've just got it sitting on my garage floor, and I've used the triangle gussets, one in each of the four corners, because my surface is not particularly level, so that takes the rock out of the frame. And then I've got the bow resting on two blocks in the center, so all the weight is on these two blocks. These stands out here are just helping to prevent the boat from heeling over. And in the back I've used these were actually the legs off of my cradle, and I had glued them up like this, and so I stuck a little bit of foam on there, and then I've got some 2x4s just screwed across. I cut a little bevel on the 2x4, I don't know if you can see that, just to help the leg tip forward to match the rocker of the hull. Probably not really necessary, but that's this pad here is pretty wide, so it catches the longitudinal bulkhead, and so that's what's supporting the stern end of the boat. So that's about 3 feet forward from the stern, and then wherever it runs out at the bow. And it's pretty stable, so I kept the stern end high enough off the ground that I can still install my outboard in the well, so that I have clearance with the shop floor. I can still get my outboard in there. The front of the boat I lowered quite a bit so that it's easier to work on. You know, this is at a comfortable working height now, and I can work in here without standing on a ladder. And I can work in here without standing on a ladder. So we'll get to work on the coamings and rounding over some of the deck structure, and so we can get an epoxy coat on all this stuff. Here's the inside of the cockpit coamings, and Taylor's getting ready to fiberglass the joint between the seat top and the side of the hull here. And we made the decision that we're going to glue on a wooden rub rail on the outside of the boat, and we're not going to install the second cleat inside the hull, and that's mainly to save weight and just simplify. And also we decided to install a little partial bulkhead, which I made here out of some scrap, into the coaming here. So that's going to fit right there, and that's just going to create a little cubby behind that hole in the cockpit coaming. And then after this little bulkhead will be like where you would store your oars, or I'm imagining, you know, maybe storing fishing poles or something, or any long pole, like maybe a tent pole or something. So that's what we're going to do. And I've also made the cutouts in the back of the boat. Everybody does these a little differently. This is what I decided to do. So this way the coaming can drain right out the back, and we'll bring our fillet and glass tape right up to this radius here, and then we'll put a little bit of glass tape here, and I'll use the cutout part to make the cover, and I'll have a cover that goes over it that's removable. Most of the time these won't get water in them, but you know, if you dip the rail sailing and water floods into the cubby hole, then it's got to drain out the back. And we'll also have a drain hole here. You'll also notice I haven't installed my beam across the top of the transom yet, and in the plans it runs all the way to the side, but I think I'm going to omit this part, and I'll fill in the little tiny gap that's left here on the coaming. Here's that piece of wood I was just talking about. We called it the rub rail backing cleat, and it's mainly just to allow space for a screw if you wanted a longer screw to hold the hollow back on. But I'm not sure it's really necessary. I can still get, you know, a 3/4 inch screw to hold the hollow back on, and this rub rail is 3/4 inches thick typically. And I had thought about doing a starboard rub rail, which would need to be mechanically fastened. So in that situation, you would definitely need a cleat here, in addition to a cleat on the inside of the cockpit, you know, forward of the companionway bulkhead. So I'm going to just omit this altogether. I think I talked about that before. And we'll just glue the rub rail on, and I think it'll be fine. I'm also getting this cabin top edge faired so I can round it over. This is going to get a piece of fiberglass as well, and then eventually it's going to carry down onto the coaming. And the port side is looking pretty good. I gouged it a little bit when I was trimming it. I'm squaring it off first, I'm making it fair, and then I'll round it over. So I've been using my sanding board on this face and this face to take out any of the waviness from gluing the cabin top down. And the port side is looking pretty good. The starboard side, I noticed we had a high spot right here in front of the deck, and you can see that I've got a batten pulled around it, and I've got about a 1/16 gap back here. So I'm trying to correct that with some clamps. And right here I've cut the deck part that's glued to the in-whale just in front of the forward bulkhead to try to have access to bending it a little farther back. And so I've got it pulled in here about 1/8 of an inch, and that's taking most of this high spot out. And so I'm gonna get some glue into this joint, which I also had to open up, and I'll get some glue under that joint, and yeah, try to bend that back in. I'll probably go ahead and glue the breast hook in as well, which goes up in here, and that will help to hold this shape. I was able to distill that clamp structure down to just these two little pieces of scrap ply anchored off on the foredeck beam of the forward bulkhead, and so these are now pulling the side into exactly where I had it with the clamps. And now I could take that batten off, so that helps me to be able to look at this. And I've also marked the outside with pencil, and I'm gonna sand it and see if we can identify this high spot with the sanding board. Yeah, you can see it pretty well. Here is a low spot here just behind the bulkhead, and there's another low spot here just in front of the bulkhead. So right where I'm trying to pull it in is a high spot, and I've pretty much gotten most of it out, so I probably am going to be pretty happy with that. I might sand it down a little more. I don't want to get this area real thin. You can see we're just starting to get into the first layer of ply. I certainly wouldn't go through the very first veneer, but that shows the high spot there. Here's the Dodger coaming installed. We started tack welding it with epoxy, but we're not quite done yet. And just wanted to show you how it fit. It went pretty well. I got impatient and I just used some plywood blocks to join the joint. You can see a little bit of a gap at the bottom. That's because it didn't fit the boat perfectly, but it was pretty close. You can see on this side I've got a small gap out here, and then it touches the hull back there. But I tried hard to follow the pen lines pretty exactly on the boat. You can see this is layer 1, so the edge of the back side of this layer is contacting the actual line on the cabin top. The second layer is going to go on this side, and its forward edge will, be in plane with that pen line. And so I started by trying to use a piece of string to bend the piece, and I did that, and I've got it secured here with a screw on either side of the garage top and one in the middle, which I later took out because it didn't need it. The garage top right now is just held down to the sliding rails with some Tainer's tape, and I made the cutout in this piece right on the pen line of the part. And then I used a blowtorch to heat up the wood to help me with this bend. It was getting pretty tight, and using a blowtorch and just holding it about 6 or 8 inches away, just far enough that it can't burn the wood but it can get it nice and hot, that will really help the wood bend as you start to melt the lignin that's holding the wood fibers together. And it has a fair amount of twist to it as it goes to the outboard edge, and this part here is pretty much in plane with the cabin side. I used a few screws back here to keep it, but these are very shallow in the cabin top. They're not going all the way through. And then this screw here I was able to land on the aft hanging knee beam, and then this screw here I lined up with a deck beam, so that's going into the deck beam. And then over here, this screw is going in sideways into the sliding rail, sliding hatch rail. And this one is just a shallow screw into the garage top. So I have very few screws. Only one of these, I think, maybe this one, is actually going through the cabin, and so it'll be easily filled, but it's only the very peak of this tip of the screw that's visible. And then to tack weld this, we're just filling in the crack on the outside with a putty knife, and we'll come back later and do a nice fillet on the inboard edge. And later, after the second layer is glued on, we'll take a saw and cut right here so that the garage can be removed and the coaming stays in place. The better way to do this here would have been to fiberglass these two parts together with a short piece of tape on this side so that it could be bent and to stay fair. This is probably going to cause me problems tomorrow when I try to glue the other half on, because as soon as I take this block off, this joint is going to want to peak, and so I'm just going to have to be careful when I take the block off, and then the second layer will do the job of this piece. But that's about it. It bent pretty well. I was pretty pleased with how it followed the lines. And so Taylor's over here getting it tacked onto the boat with just thickened epoxy, filling up that crack between the screws.